Hey everyone, welcome to Logan's Mosh Pit. Glad to have you here. Do me a favor and please subscribe if you haven't already. I'm psyched to bring you another episode of Rock and Read. Today we'll be reading Chapter 5 of My Life in the Eagles by Don Felder. Let's see what Don does in Chapter 5. Here we go. Summer ended, and with it, my dream. Susan had to return to Boston. We were still madly in love, but part of her desperately wanted to go home. She missed the northern weather, the myriad colors of fall, and the long cold winters. She also enrolled at a respected girls' college and was looking forward to starting her next academic phase. In that respect, we couldn't have been more different. When she left town in the front seat of her brother Bill's car, I thought I'd die. It hurt so bad. In the space of a couple of months, I'd lost my first true love and my best friend. And I had to cut off all communication with my parents. I was barely able to grasp that so much bad stuff was happening to me at once. I had rarely been out of Florida, only a few childhood car trips to Oklahoma and Washington, into a couple gigs in New York, but now I traveled to Boston whenever I could, catching a bus or hitching a ride with Bill whenever he was going home. Once I even scraped together enough money to fly there. It was my first time in an airplane, a DC-3 tail dragger, and it seemed like a miracle to be flying over America instead of driving. Susan and I had a great time in Massachusetts, picking up where we had left off, until I had to fly home again. This time, the parting seemed even harder. Alone again in Gainesville, everything changed. I was 18 years old, and I felt bereft. The Monty Quintet disbanded when Tom Long went off to college, leaving me with a drummer and Barry, the bass player. For the first time in many years, I had no band, and was, for a while, completely without direction. My relationship with Susan was under incredible strain because of the distance between us, and after several months of commuting back and forth, trying to keep it going, I realized it was impossible. This isn't going to work, I told her, long distance, not unless one of us is prepared to move to where the other lives, and that ain't going to happen. I think I broke her heart, and mine too, but I knew it couldn't last. When I hung up the phone, I didn't think I'd ever see or hear from her again. I was still teaching kids how to play guitar, and I had a couple of other jobs, but I couldn't decide if I should go back to school or not. My parents and Jerry were pushing me to go to college and learn a profession, but I felt that would be a betrayal of all I had tried to achieve. Whatever I decided, I knew I desperately needed to play music, which was the only thing I felt remotely good at. A guy named Paul Hillis, who had worked at Lipham's as a music teacher, had just returned from 2 years in Boston at the Berklee College of Music. He was 6 years older than me, an excellent guitar player, fluent in jazz techniques. When he came back, I couldn't wait to hear him play and see what he had learned, but to my surprise, he switched instruments. Guitar is so limiting, he told me, dismissively. He claimed it was easier to compose, harmonize, and understand theory on a piano. He opened up the Paul Hillis School of Music in Gainesville, and I signed up to learn jazz theory and composition from him in exchange for teaching his incoming guitar students. For each hour I'd do for him, he'd give me an hour of his time. In less than 6 months, I learned what Berklee College of Music had taught him in 2.5 years. I soaked up every scrap of information. Through the fraternity circuit and friends in the music business, a young band called Flo, based in Ocala, approached me. "Join us," they said. "We've heard the Monty Quintet and we know your work. We need a strong lead guitarist." There were 3 in the band: Mike Barnett, the drummer John Winter, who played keyboards and soprano sax, and Chuck Newcomb, who sang and played bass. Flo was, without doubt, what my father would have called a hippie band. They specialized in freeform jazz rock and were heavily into pot. I had to travel down to Ocala to practice with them, and at 2 in the afternoon, they'd still be in bed, stoned, or recovering from the night before. Their rental house was filthy, with a sink full of dirty dishes that no one ever seemed to wash. They were complete stoners, but they were good musicians too, and when we were together, we played really well. They had a genuine commitment to music, not to great songwriting or marketing like the Beatles, but a dedication to writing songs in a pop-rock genre, using the framework of improvisation that jazz players use, a free flow of creative energy, they called it. We'd start off singing a couple of verses and a chorus, and then have a free-form solo section in the middle that could be anywhere from a minute to 5 minutes long, depending on how well it was going. Winding down, we'd sing a verse and a chorus, and that would be that. It was perfect tripping music, but a more modern sound than a jazz band. It was really quite innovative for its time, and the best part was that every time you played, you were thrown naked out onto the floor, figuratively speaking. Two of their friends were the road managers for a successful band called the Young Rascals, who had a big hit with a song called Good Lovin' and had appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show. They promised to come from New York and listen to Flo, play once we felt we were ready. I was brought in to help sharpen up their act. In return, I got to latch onto this incredible spark of creativity. Every night, every time I played, I was given a chance to improvise. Using all that Paul Hillis had been teaching me about melodic phrasing, I learned how to play spontaneously and think freely, without inhibitions or fear. I began to become comfortable with the tools I had. Someone would play a groove and I'd just start playing stuff, some of which would be okay and some of which would be great. There was a constant creative stream. The freer I became, the more confidence I gained. It helped me amazingly in my ability to write and come up with parts for songs later in life. With Susan and Bernie gone and nobody else to take their place, I could easily have gone off the rails, especially with the band smoking so much pot. Fortunately, for some reason, I never fully understood. I didn't have an addictive personality. I enjoyed the occasional joint, of course, but I'd always stop myself at the point where I felt like I was losing control. I'd had a couple paranoid experiences, and I had seen heroin addicts lying on the streets in New York. As far as I could see, pot smoking just made my fellow band members unmotivated and lethargic. I don't think any of them had ever held a steady job. Worse than that, the whole drug thing still scared the out of me. Some rock and roller I was cut out to be. I spent a lot of time moping around, missing Susan, and feeling sorry for myself. I dated a couple of girls, but none ever sparked like Susan and me. One girl who went by the unusual name of Season Hubley came from New York to Gainesville to visit friends on the campus. She was the first girl since Susan that I really liked, and I thought we might have had something going, but she didn't seem very interested in me. She was just passing through. Then Susan's brother, Bill, introduced me to, cheek this name out, Jan Booty, his girlfriend's roommate. Jan, the daughter of a diplomat, was more permanent, studying art in Gainesville. She was very creative, and I liked that about her. We ended up living together for a while, sharing a house with the couple, Barry and Patty, and Jan's two pet dogs, Rhythm and Blues. It was while I was living with Jan that my brother Jerry came to call. I had had little contact with him since he had gotten married. He was working in a small law firm in Gainesville, and we didn't have much in common. Now that I was living immorally, however, he felt obligated to come and tell me what he thought of me. I always suspected that Dad put him up to it. "What the are you doing with your life, Don?" he asked me, his face pinched. In his suit and tie, he seemed far older than his 25 years, because it looks to me like you're just wasting it. Before I could respond, he let rip about how everything I was doing was wrong. My views on the Vietnam War were unpatriotic, my associations with protesters, musicians, and drug users were questionable, my morals and values were all screwed up, and I was headed for disaster. He thought I was a lost cause, and he let me know it. We got into an intense argument, and I said many things I knew I was going to regret. "You're worse than Dad," I berated him. "You've been towing the line for so long, you have no idea what real life's all about. What are you going to do next, Jerry? Take off your belt and whip me?" He eventually walked away in disgust, but not before we had both said our piece. As I watched him go, I doubted if we'd ever speak again. Everyone I loved, it seemed, eventually walked away from me. Music lifted me from the sadness that was my life. With the dual influences of Flo and Barry, the husband of the couple Jane and I shared a house with, I became interested in jazz for the first time. Barry came from New York and was addicted to jazz, which he seemed to play endlessly. Because of him, I began listening to it more closely, studying jazz guitar, learning specific solos, and acquiring a taste for people like Sonny Rollins and Django Reinhardt. I soon began to view the guitar differently. Country, rock and roll, and bluegrass sounded pretty archaic compared with something much more sophisticated and intellectual. Having been exposed to so much theory with Paul, jazz suddenly made sense. One Friday morning, I was listening to Mel Bay while Barry read aloud from the Village Voice, which he got by mail from New York, as it was next to impossible to buy in Gainesville. "Oh my God," Barry said, sitting up suddenly. "Miles Davis is playing at the Village Gate tomorrow night." I'd heard of Miles Davis, but I never heard anyone play live jazz except at the Holiday Inn Cocktail Lounge, and then just movie themes. Miles Davis? I asked innocently. Only one of the best jazz musicians in the world, Barry cried incredulously. Staring at me in silence for a moment, he added authoritatively, "Pack a bag. We're going." There was no arguing with him, so we grabbed some clean t-shirts and a toothbrush each, filled up his VW with gas, and took off. We drove non-stop, taking turns sleeping. The journey took more than 16 hours. We arrived in Manhattan, found some seedy little $19 a night hotel, took a shower, put on clean shirts, and hopped a cab to Greenwich Village. We walked into the village gate and sat down near the front. About 20 minutes later, the band we'd been reading about the morning before in Gainesville was standing right in front of us on the stage. Those musicians proceeded to shred me. The finesse and the improvisation and the freedom in their art was unbelievable, with numbers like Bitches Brew. It was one of the most incredible lineups Miles Davis ever had. Him on horn, 17-year-old Tony Williams on drums, Herbie Hancock on piano, Wayne Shorter on tenor sax, and Ron Carter on bass. Halfway through their second set, Miles Davis took a break and sat down at a table by the restrooms to have a beer. There were no dressing rooms and nowhere else for him to escape to. Determined to go over and tell him how much I liked the way he played, I started walking toward him with that intention. When I was just a few paces away, he looked up at me with those intense eyes, as if to say, "Come near me, boy, and I'll eat you alive." So I just kept walking right past him and into the men's room. Inside, I stared at myself in the cracked mirror and whipped up my courage. "I gotta go say it. I gotta go say it," I repeated like a mantra, and out I came, determined to shake his hand like I had with B.B. King. But of course, by then, he was gone. That gig was probably one of the most formative experiences of my life. B.B. King had blown me away with his rhythm and blues, but this was undoubtedly my strongest jazz influence, an event that showed me what real musicians could do. The dexterity, ability, and dynamics were from another, altogether more sophisticated genre. This was yet another level for me, a challenge to confront at a time when I was already into jazz in a big way, and playing it with flow. I hardly slept a wink that night in the hotel, for replaying the gig over and over in my head, and Barry and I drove home in silence the following morning. Not long afterward, I was lying in bed with Jan one sunny summer afternoon, watching the curtains billowing in the breeze, when a song came on the radio. Sitting up, straining to listen, I recognized the voice instantly. The presenter announced the number as "For What It's Worth" by Buffalo Springfield, but I knew better. The voice I had heard belonged to Stephen Stills, the runaway kid with the military haircut who had played in the Continentals. Wow, I thought, lying back on the pillow with a smile. He struck oil after all. That's really cool. Maybe I could do something like that one day. Every time I heard that song, which became an anthem for the country's most turbulent decade of young people railing against the establishment, I thought of Stephen and smiled. However, unlike him and Bernie, I wasn't yet driven enough about my music to pursue it at the expense of everything else. By the fall of 1968, Flo was ready for its showcase concert in New York. John Cologna and Andy Leo, the road managers, had come down to Florida to hear us and like what they heard. They felt they had discovered the band through their friendship with Mike and John, and could promote us through their relationship with the Young Rascals. They were right, and they were certainly the best access we had had since the Circle to someone famous. The gig was to be at a small club in Manhattan called the Fillmore East. The Allman Brothers had played there just before us. Tough act to follow, right? They were streaming ahead of us in terms of success. Dwayne had been doing some impressive session work. They had recorded an album in L.A., abandoning the name the Almond Joys in favor of the Hourglass, but they still kept in contact through friends in Daytona and Gainesville, and we wished each other well. We drove up from Florida in a van with borrowed equipment from the Young Rascals and set up the stage. Road managers had invited some record company executives along to hear us play. Among them was Creed Taylor, a legend in the business, who had worked with Stan Getz and had just produced the Quincy Jones album Walking in Space, a phenomenal creation. He was the man. We were one of 3 bands playing to around 500 people that night in a club that was relatively new and unheard of. I knew Hendrix had once played there, and I had seen Paul Butterfield and a monster blues guitar player named Buzzy Feeden in the past, so I was impressed enough to know that this was for real. Fortunately, we played really well that night, and when the gig was over, Creed Taylor came backstage to see us. Creed was middle-aged, wore a suede jacket with patches on the sleeves, and exuded calm. "Okay, guys, I liked what I heard tonight. "You were great," he told us. "I'm prepared to offer you a recording contract worth $5,000. What do you say?" It was the most money we'd ever made. We couldn't believe our luck. After a hasty band meeting with the road managers, we accepted immediately and signed on the line the next day. Despite all my reservations about leaving Gainesville, here I was, a few months later, in the Big Apple, with a record deal. New York was somehow less scary than California. I had been here a couple times before. I could drive home in less than 24 hours if I wanted to, and anyway, I was too excited about the future to be frightened anymore. Our $5,000 advance lasted less than a month. We put a deposit on the Dodge delivery van. I was the only one with a good enough credit rating to take on the payments. A warm coat each, and a couple of microphones for our PA system. The rest went on grass, food, rolled cigarettes, and Jack Daniels. Signed up with Creed Taylor Incorporated, or CTI, we found a small apartment on Horatio Street on the Lower West Side. It was in the meatpacking district, and not a particularly good place to be in those days. I was nearly mugged at knife point, and a friend who came to stay was hit in the back of the head with a wooden plank by another robber. The road managers helped us with our writing and rehearsing, and they organized a few gigs around town to keep us working. The Young Rascals became our sponsors. They had had another couple of hits after Groovin' and A Girl Like You, and they gave us some of their old instruments and loaned us a PA so we could play clubs. There was a set of drums from Dino Danelli and a Hammond B3 keyboard from Felix Cavalier, and Gene Cornish gave me one of his guitars, a big Gibson Electric. Living in New York as a part of a band with a record deal was all very well, but my excitement was tempered by the fact that my fellow musicians were lethargic and excessively drug-oriented. I had always been the motivator before, booking the gigs and making the contacts. I was as much a manager as a player. But this band's contact was through Mike and John, not me, and the rest of the guys had the idea that they didn't have to do very much, because the road managers were going to make them stars. I felt kind of helpless, unable to do anything about the situation. We were living in a crappy apartment with no money, and none of them ever did anything except play music. Jan and I had split up because of the distance, and I felt increasingly lonely and miserable. My frustration was only highlighted whenever Bernie came to town. He and I had stayed in touch, and he was doing very well for himself. When he had first moved back to California, he joined a folk rock band called Hearts and Flowers as a banjo and guitar player and performed on their second album. Through his old friend Chris Hillman, he met Gene Clark from the Byrds and the legendary banjo player Doug Dillard. Bernie also formed the band Dillard and Clark until he joined the Corvettes, Linda Rosette's backup band for the tour to promote her debut solo album after leaving the Stone Ponies, home-sown, homegrown. "You gotta come back west with me. That's where it's all happening, man," Bernie would say every time I saw him. We'd meet backstage at whichever gig he was playing, jam a little, and have a few beers. "I've made some great contacts, and I'm sure I can get you work." "Thanks, Bernie," I'd say cynically, "but I'm gonna hang around here first and see what happens with the flow. We have a record deal now, and I'd be crazy not to see it through. Besides, I don't have any money, or even a car. How am I supposed to get around in LA without wheels?" When it finally came time for Flo to go into the recording studio and cut its first album, we were all pretty scared. Creed Taylor used a studio over in Englewood Cliffs, New Jersey. The room we used was round and was supposed to have a natural ambiance. It was owned and run by Rudy Van Gelder, a German optometrist by trade who had become a recording engineer with impeccable credentials. He had worked with Miles Davis, John Coltrane, and Thelonious Monk, and was said to be responsible for the Blue Note sound. He had top-notch Newman microphones and state-of-the-art 8-track recording equipment with mixing consoles and equalizers. He sat in his recording booth, manning the controls like some mad scientist. He literally wore white gloves to make his very antiseptic, high-fidelity recordings. One day, Andy and John took us into Atlantic Studios and allowed us to listen in while the Young Rascals were cutting their latest single. We knew them well, and the atmosphere was relaxed. They were on the last take by the time we arrived, and we stood at the edge of the studio and listened to them record "It's a Beautiful Morning." I liked it immediately. It had bongos and sounded really cool. I wondered if it would be a hit. When it was our turn to set up in the Englewood Cliffs studio, we were very edgy. It was our first real recording, and we felt under immense pressure in this clinical environment with a man in a white lab coat and the latest high-tech equipment all around us. Creed came in, sat down in the control room, looking for all the world as though he was going to pull out a pipe and smoke it, but he didn't say a word. There was no musical direction, nothing. I realized suddenly, and with considerable discomfort, that it wasn't Creed Taylor or Rudy Van Gelder who made all those legendary recordings. It was the artists themselves. I wasn't the only one with butterflies in my stomach. We began to play, but you could hear and feel that it was a very forced performance. In fact, it was a train wreck, and there was nothing any of us could do to pull it back from the abyss. The album was called Flow, and the cover featured a stencil of the band's name with soap suds dripping from it. That inspired my thumbnail. We hated it! We thought it looked like an ad for laundry detergent. I was proud of the album because it was my first, but I was also hugely disappointed. I expected to take it out of the sleeve, put it on the turntable, and be blown away like I was with the Quincy Jones record. I'd used the same recording techniques, engineer, and producer. I just couldn't understand why my record didn't affect me in the same spine-tingling way. There was further disappointment. We had a fair amount of airplay around New York, but we weren't AM-oriented, and a lot of radio stations wouldn't play us because of our long jazz solos. Word came back that we were all right, but we weren't the Young Rascals. We might have looked and sounded a bit like them, but we were a marketing nightmare because there was no obvious slot for us. We picked up an eclectic following of jazz buffs instead of the mainstream fans that were going to the clubs and buying records. There was no talk of a follow-up album, and suddenly there were longer and longer periods without work. Even though we'd had some success, drugs, not music, had motivated it. Our managers were frustrated. They had pretty much explored all the limited avenues they had access to. When we did get some gigs, we wound up having to do mostly cover versions of other people's songs to pay the bills. We tried to slip a few of our original numbers into the set, hoping that people would understand what we were about, and some seemed to like it, but most just wanted to dance. I realized we had to get out of New York and into an environment that would be more conducive to songwriting and taking the band to the next level. Mike had driven to Poughkeepsie to see a friend the week before and had spotted a for rent sign at the side of the road in a little town called Dover Plains. He scrawled down the telephone number. After speaking to the owner and realizing that we could afford the rental, we piled onto parking quilts in the back of our Dodge van and drove north. Bob Dylan's backup group, the band, had relocated to a modern pink house in West Saugerties in the Catskills and recorded their first album, Music from the Big Pink. The house we found wasn't pink. It was white, stood on 350 acres, and looked like something out of Gone with the Wind. It cost us $150 a month, far less than the price of our crummy New York apartment. The house was huge. It had 4 white painted Doric columns at the door, which opened onto an impressive hallway and grand staircase. There were a library, 5 fireplaces, and a butler's pantry. The attic had been converted into a ballroom, complete with bandstand for parties. Much of the land had been left wild, although some of it must have been used to grow market produce at one time, because all that grew on it now, in great abundance, was zucchini. Impoverished and permanently hungry, we had scrambled zucchini for breakfast, zucchini sandwiches for lunch, and baked zucchini with cheese for supper. We lived in that house for 18 months, becoming poorer and poorer by the month. Our gigs in New York declined sharply, and half the time the rest of the band couldn't be bothered to make the 3-hour trip to the city for a lousy $100. We were often without transportation. If someone took the van to go and score some drugs or see a girlfriend, the rest of us would be stranded. One day Chuck Newcomb and I were in the house when the van was gone and we ran out of tobacco. Both heavy smokers, we had no choice but to walk into town and buy some. We set off for Dover Plains, not even bothering to hitchhike, because we knew from experience that few people in the neighborhood would pick up a couple of long-haired hippies with beards. The local sheriff drove past Chuck and me as we strolled into town, stopped his patrol car, reversed, and picked us up. We were arrested and charged with walking on the wrong side of the road. The fine was $25. The sheriff eventually drove us back to the house, where our surprised fellow band members saw the patrol car pull up in the driveway and quickly ran round and hid all the drugs. John Winter came wandering out of the house with a flute in his hand. "What's going on?" he asked. The sheriff gave little explanation before he and his officers undertook a painstaking search of the house. It took some time, and when he emerged, his face was a picture of disappointment that he hadn't found bathtubs full of LSD. Trying to defuse the situation, which was now uncomfortably tense, I turned to John and said, "Hey, why don't you play something for the officer to send him on his way?" "Huh?" John said, looking decidedly nonplussed. Your flute, I said, pointing to the instrument in his hand. Why don't you play something to show there are no hard feelings? John shook his head. No, not now. My lips don't feel right, man. I can't play a thing. Oh, come on, I urged, sensing his reluctance and the sheriff's unhappiness. Just a few notes. Yeah, come on, the sheriff encouraged him. You claim you're musicians. Let's hear you play. John stood his ground. No, he said firmly. I'm sorry. I'm not in the mood. By the time the sheriff and his men left, Chuck and I were exhausted and upset from our day's excursions. All we had to look forward to was a zucchini omelet and a miserable night, emptying the ashtrays for butts. Irritable, I bumped into John in the hallway and turned on him. If you had played your flute for the sheriff, none of this might have happened, I said. John shrugged his shoulders. I couldn't, man, he explained, pointing to a wad of something in the end of it. That's where we shoved all the dope. Wow. Well, that's the end of Chapter 5. Let me know what you guys thought of Chapter 5 in the comments below. That does it for today's video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. I really appreciate the support. I'll see you next time. Until then, rock on.